The woman opening the door wasn't just my best friend's mother. She was the last person I was ever supposed to fall in love with. I wish I could tell you that everything began with a stolen glance or some dramatic twist of fate, but the truth is quieter than that. It began with silence. The kind that settles into a house after divorce papers have been signed, after every picture frame has been turned face down, after you stop expecting another set of footsteps in the hallway. At 41, I had become frighteningly good at living inside that silence. My condo in Portland overlooked the river, but even the view felt distant now, as if life were happening on the opposite shore. When Olivia called and asked if I could spend a few weeks in Cedar Falls while she handled an unexpected business trip overseas, I almost said no. I hadn't visited our hometown in years. Too many memories. Too many versions of myself I no longer recognized. Mom won't ask for help, Olivia sighed through the phone. She says she's fine, but she twisted her ankle carrying boxes in the bookstore. She could really use someone around. I stared out my kitchen window as rain traced slow lines across the glass. I'll be there tomorrow, I heard myself say before fear could answer instead. The drive took nearly 6 hours. Pine forests stretched beside the highway, and small towns drifted past like forgotten photographs. Somewhere between mile marker 192 and a roadside diner serving blueberry pie, I realized I wasn't just driving toward Cedar Falls. I was driving away from the woman I had become after 15 years of trying to make a marriage survive on habit instead of hope. The bookstore looked exactly the way I remembered it. White brick walls, navy blue awning, brass bell above the entrance. The sign still read Hayes and Pages in elegant gold lettering. I stood outside with my overnight bag in one hand and a paper cup of coffee growing cold in the other. My heartbeat felt strangely loud. Then the bell chimed. The door opened. Victoria Hayes smiled before she recognized me. It was a polite smile meant for strangers, warm without asking for anything in return. Then her green eyes widened ever so slightly. Emily, she said, almost as if she were remembering the name while saying it. Time had touched her gently. Silver threaded through her chestnut hair, gathered loosely at the back of her neck. Fine lines rested near her eyes like evidence of a life fully lived instead of something to hide. She wore a soft blue cardigan with rolled sleeves, and there was a pencil tucked behind one ear. She looked less like someone's mother than someone who had finally learned how to belong to herself. It's been a long time, I managed. Far too long, she answered. Her voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had survived storms without losing kindness. She reached for the door, holding it open despite the walking boot around her ankle. Come inside before your coffee gets any colder. The familiar scent of old paper, cedar shelves, and fresh cinnamon drifted toward me. Something inside my chest loosened without permission. I stepped across the threshold believing I was simply helping my best friend for a few weeks. I had no idea that the first thing waiting for me inside that little bookstore wasn't another chapter of my old life. It was the beginning of one I had never imagined. The first morning began with the sound of rain tapping gently against the bookstore windows. I woke in the small guest room above the shop, wrapped in unfamiliar quiet that somehow felt softer than the silence waiting back in Portland. Sunlight struggled through gray clouds, painting pale streaks across the hardwood floor. For the first time in months, I did not reach for my phone to distract myself from another empty day. The rich aroma of fresh coffee drifted upstairs before I heard Victoria's voice. "Do you still take cream?" she called. I smiled before I could stop myself. "You remembered?" I answered as I made my way down the narrow staircase. She looked up from the old espresso machine with a small shrug. "Some things stay with you." The kitchen sat behind the bookstore, no larger than a breakfast nook, yet every shelf seemed to hold years of ordinary happiness. Handmade mugs hung beneath wooden cabinets. A faded calendar still displayed handwritten birthdays. Fresh lavender rested inside a glass jar beside the sink. Victoria slid a warm mug toward me before settling carefully into a chair, her walking boot resting on another. "I usually open at 9, she said. "Would you mind helping customers until I move around a little easier?" "That is why I came." "No," she replied with a gentle smile. "You came because you are loyal. Helping is simply what loyal people do." Her words lingered long after breakfast ended. The bookstore slowly filled as the morning passed. An elderly couple searched for travel guides. A young mother let her little boy choose his first mystery novel. Teenagers wandered through the used vinyl records tucked into one corner. Victoria seemed to know everyone by name. She remembered favorite authors, grandchildren, anniversaries, even which customers secretly tucked pressed flowers inside library books. Watching her felt strangely comforting. She never rushed anyone. She listened with her whole attention, as though every conversation deserved a quiet place to land. Around lunchtime, I climbed a short ladder to straighten a shelf of classic novels. One box slipped before I caught it. Victoria instinctively stepped forward to help, forgetting about her ankle. She caught herself against the counter with a soft laugh. "Old habits," she admitted. "I keep forgetting I am supposed to let someone else carry the heavy things." "Then let me remember for both of us," I said. She looked at me for one brief moment, her green eyes warm with gratitude instead of embarrassment. Something unspoken settled gently between us. Not romance. Not yet. Simply trust. Later that afternoon, rain began falling harder. Customers hurried home, leaving only the quiet rustle of pages turning beneath the steady rhythm outside. We reorganized a shipment of donated books together, kneeling across opposite sides of the wooden floor. Every now and then our hands reached for the same hardcover at the same time. Each accidental pause ended with the same small smile. Nothing dramatic happened. No music played. No impossible coincidence appeared to change our lives. And yet, as I watched droplets race down the front window while Victoria carefully repaired a torn dust jacket with practiced hands, I realized something unexpected. For the first time since my marriage had ended, I was no longer counting the hours until another lonely evening. I was simply present. Somehow, inside that little bookstore filled with stories written by strangers, my own life had quietly begun turning a page. By the fourth day, the bookstore had settled into a rhythm that felt almost musical. Every morning began with coffee, the gentle ring of the brass bell above the front door, and Victoria humming softly while she arranged fresh flowers beside the register. She never seemed aware she was doing it. It was simply part of the room, like sunlight drifting across worn wooden shelves, or the comforting scent of cedar and old paper. I found myself noticing little things that would have escaped me a week earlier. She always straightened crooked books before helping a customer. She tucked loose strands of silver-streaked hair behind her ear whenever she concentrated. She thanked every delivery driver by name. Kindness came so naturally to her that it looked effortless. One quiet afternoon, a little girl wandered into the children's section while her father searched for gardening books. She picked up a worn copy of Charlotte's Web, frowned and whispered, "I cannot buy this one. It is old." Victoria smiled and knelt carefully beside her despite the walking boot. "Do you know why I love old books?" she asked. The little girl shook her head. Victoria gently opened the cover, revealing a handwritten message dated 1986. "Because someone loved this story before you did. Now it gets to belong to someone new." The child smiled as though she had just discovered magic. I watched from across the aisle, pretending to organize biographies while something inside me quietly shifted. My marriage had taught me efficiency. Victoria was teaching me presence. That evening, after locking the front door, we carried 2 folding chairs into the tiny garden behind the bookstore. The rain had finally passed, leaving the air cool and fragrant with damp earth and blooming jasmine. Fireflies blinked lazily near the fence while the sky melted into soft shades of lavender and gold. Victoria handed me a glass of iced tea with slices of fresh lemon floating inside. "Olivia used to sit right there after school," she said, pointing toward the old maple tree. "She would tell me every secret she thought I did not already know." I laughed. "She was never very mysterious." "No," Victoria agreed with a quiet smile. "But she always had a wonderful heart." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to crickets replace the birds as daylight slowly disappeared. I realized it had been years since silence had felt peaceful instead of awkward. Finally, she spoke again. "How are you really doing, Emily?" The question landed gently, without curiosity or judgment. Just care. I looked down at the condensation sliding along my glass. "Some days I still reach for a life that no longer exists." She nodded without interrupting. "And other days?" I breathed slowly before answering. "Other days I remember there might be another one waiting." Victoria smiled, not because she had solved anything, but because she understood exactly what those words cost. As darkness settled around the little garden, a cool breeze lifted the loose pages of a notebook resting on the table beside her. Without thinking, I reached to catch them at the same moment she did. Our fingertips brushed for the briefest instant. Neither of us pulled away immediately. There was no rush of impossible certainty, no dramatic spark that belonged only in movies. There was simply warmth. Human, quiet, undeniable. We exchanged an almost embarrassed smile before looking toward the stars beginning to appear overhead. Neither of us mentioned the moment. We did not need to. Some feelings arrive without asking for attention. They simply take a seat beside you, patient enough to wait until your heart is finally ready to recognize them. The next few days slipped by so naturally that I stopped counting them. Morning coffee became a habit neither of us questioned. I learned exactly how Victoria liked the front display arranged, always mixing new arrivals with weathered classics because, as she liked to say, every fresh story deserved an old friend. Beside it, she laughed whenever I alphabetized too carefully, insisting that readers often found the book they truly needed only after looking for something entirely different. There was a quiet wisdom in the way she moved through life, as though she had long ago stopped trying to control every outcome and had learned instead to welcome unexpected turns. One Thursday afternoon, the bookstore remained unusually empty. Heavy clouds gathered above Cedar Falls, turning the windows into soft gray mirrors. We spent the slow hours unpacking a collection of donated novels from an estate sale. Each book carried little reminders that someone else had once loved it. A pressed maple leaf, a faded grocery receipt, birthday notes written in careful handwriting. Victoria held up one well-worn novel with a smile. "People always think stories live inside the pages," she said. "Sometimes they live between them." I looked at the tiny photograph tucked inside the cover, showing an older couple standing on a beach with the ocean behind them. "Do you ever wonder what happened to them?" I asked. "Every single time," she replied. "But I also like believing they found more happiness than heartbreak." Before I could answer, thunder rolled gently across the sky. The lights flickered once, then disappeared completely. The familiar hum of the bookstore faded into stillness. Rain arrived moments later, drumming against the roof with steady determination. Victoria reached beneath the counter and smiled. "Power outages happen more often than you would think." She placed 2 thick candles on the register and handed one to me. Soon their warm glow filled the room with dancing shadows, transforming rows of books into golden silhouettes. Customers hurried home before the storm grew stronger, leaving only the sound of rain and the occasional crackle of thunder in the distance. We closed early, locking the front door while water streamed down the windows in silver ribbons. Instead of going upstairs, Victoria led me toward a small sitting area tucked behind the history shelves. A stone fireplace rested against the far wall. She lit a few pieces of seasoned cedar, and within minutes gentle flames filled the room with warmth and the unmistakable scent of wood smoke. We settled into opposite ends of an old sofa, each holding another cup of coffee while rain wrapped the bookstore in its quiet embrace. "Storms used to make me nervous," I admitted. "Why?" she asked softly. I stared into the fire before answering. "Because I spent years pretending everything was fine. Whenever it rained, I worried the silence between us would finally become impossible to ignore." Victoria remained quiet for a long moment. "After my husband passed away," she said at last, "I was afraid of silence for a different reason. I thought if the house became too quiet, I would forget the sound of his voice." She smiled gently, not with sadness but with acceptance. "Then one day I realized love does not disappear when someone stops speaking. Sometimes it changes into gratitude." Her words settled deep inside me. We watched the flames without feeling any pressure to fill the space between us. Outside, lightning briefly illuminated the rain-soaked street before fading back into darkness. Inside, everything felt remarkably calm. As another log shifted softly in the fireplace, Victoria reached for the blanket folded beside her and spread half of it across my knees without saying a word. It was such a simple gesture that it almost brought tears to my eyes. No grand declarations. No impossible promises. Just quiet care offered as naturally as breathing. In that gentle light, with rain whispering against the windows and warmth surrounding us from every direction, I began to understand that healing rarely arrived all at once. Sometimes it entered a life as quietly as someone noticing you might be cold before you realized it yourself. The storm passed during the night, leaving Cedar Falls washed clean beneath a bright blue sky that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. The sidewalks still glistened from the rain, and every tree around the bookstore shimmered with tiny drops that caught the morning sunlight like scattered pieces of glass. Business returned quickly, but something between Victoria and me had changed in a way neither of us acknowledged. We spoke as we always had, laughed over misplaced bookmarks and curious customers, yet every quiet glance seemed to last a heartbeat longer than before. It was not uncomfortable. It was simply new. Late that afternoon, Victoria disappeared into the storage room searching for a box of antique journals a customer had requested. After several minutes passed, I walked back to see if she needed help. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight filtering from a small window near the ceiling. Shelves lined every wall, filled with forgotten editions waiting patiently for another chance to be opened. "Could you check the top shelf?" she asked, pointing toward an old wooden ladder. I climbed carefully and reached for a weathered box tied with faded blue ribbon. As I lifted it down, another small bundle slipped free and landed gently at my feet. Several envelopes scattered across the floor, their cream-colored paper softened by time. I immediately knelt to gather them, intending only to place them back inside the box. Then one envelope turned over in my hand. The handwriting was elegant and unmistakably personal. "My dearest Victoria." I froze. Before I could look away, Victoria quietly crossed the room and accepted the letters from my hands with remarkable calm. There was no panic in her expression. No anger. Only tenderness mixed with memory. "I should have stored these somewhere safer," she said softly. "I am sorry," I replied. "I was not trying to read them." "I know." She rested the bundle against her chest for a moment before smiling gently. "These were from my husband. He wrote letters even when we lived in the same house." My curiosity remained silent, but she noticed it anyway. "He believed ordinary days deserved love letters more than special occasions." She untied the ribbon and carefully removed one envelope. "Would you like to hear something?" I nodded almost without thinking. Her voice became quieter as she read a single paragraph. He wrote about watching her shelve books one rainy afternoon decades earlier. He described how she always tucked loose hair behind her ear while concentrating, and how that tiny habit reminded him that love often lived inside moments everyone else overlooked. When she finished, the room remained completely still. I realized I had been holding my breath. "He loved you very much," I whispered. Victoria folded the letter with extraordinary care before returning it to the envelope. "He did," she answered. "And I loved him with my whole heart." She paused before looking directly at me. "People sometimes believe loving someone once means your heart belongs only to the past." A faint smile touched her lips. "I do not think that anymore." I searched her face, unsure whether she was speaking about herself, about grief, or about something neither of us was ready to name. "Love changes us," she continued. "If we are fortunate, it also leaves enough room for us to keep growing." We carried the box back into the bookstore without saying another word. Yet the silence felt different now, filled not with uncertainty but with quiet possibility. That evening, after closing, I remained alone among the shelves while Victoria balanced the register in her office. My eyes wandered across hundreds of stories waiting to be discovered, but I could not concentrate on a single title. Her words echoed gently through my mind. Loving someone once does not mean your heart belongs only to the past. For the first time since my divorce, I allowed myself to wonder whether healing was not simply about letting go of what had ended. Perhaps it was also about finding the courage to believe that life still held chapters one had never imagined reading. The following Saturday began before sunrise. Victoria was already awake when I came downstairs, wrapping fresh muffins in brown paper while the smell of cinnamon drifted through the quiet bookstore. She looked up with the same gentle smile that had somehow become the part of every morning I looked forward to most. "There is a small estate sale about 30 miles away," she said. "The family called yesterday. They have several first editions they would rather see stay in an independent bookstore than disappear into a warehouse." I reached for my coffee. "Let me drive." She hesitated for only a second before nodding. I suppose that is one advantage of having someone who insists on carrying all the heavy boxes. The drive carried us through rolling farmland and winding country roads lined with old maple trees. The windows were down, letting cool summer air fill the truck while a local radio station played familiar songs neither of us felt the need to sing along with. Comfortable silence had become our language. Every few miles Victoria pointed toward places that held pieces of her life. The diner where she and her husband had shared breakfast every anniversary. The little church where Olivia had sung in the holiday choir. The hiking trail she had not visited since before her ankle injury. She spoke without sadness, as though memories had become companions instead of burdens. The estate sale occupied a weathered farmhouse overlooking open fields that stretched farther than I could see. Inside, every room overflowed with books, framed photographs, antique lamps, and carefully folded quilts. We spent nearly 2 hours sorting through shelves, laughing whenever we discovered duplicate copies of the same classic hidden in different corners of the house. At one point I watched Victoria gently comfort the elderly homeowner, thanking her for trusting the bookstore with her late sister's collection. There was nothing performative about her kindness. She listened more than she spoke, and somehow that made every word she offered feel meaningful. By early afternoon, the bed of the truck was filled with sturdy boxes tied down beneath a canvas cover. Dark clouds gathered again as we started home. "Looks like we are racing another storm," I said. Victoria glanced toward the horizon. "Around here, storms usually win." 20 minutes later, the first heavy drops struck the windshield. Rain quickly blurred the road ahead, forcing me to slow down. Then the truck gave a sharp shudder. A warning light flashed across the dashboard. I guided us carefully onto the shoulder just as the engine lost power. We sat quietly for a moment while rain drummed against the roof with growing intensity. "Well," Victoria said with surprising calm, "that is unfortunate." I laughed despite myself. "You have an impressive way of understating things." Roadside assistance estimated more than 2 hours before anyone could reach us because of the weather. A small family owned and stood less than half a mile away, its porch light glowing warmly through the rain. We gathered what we needed and hurried across the parking lot beneath one oversized umbrella that barely protected either of us. By the time we stepped inside, our sleeves were damp and we were both laughing harder than the situation deserved. The woman behind the front desk welcomed us with fresh towels and apologetic eyes. "I only have one room left because of the storm," she explained. I glanced toward Victoria, ready to suggest waiting in the lobby instead. She met my eyes for a brief moment before offering the smallest smile. "One night," she said quietly. "Tomorrow we will figure everything else out." I nodded, surprised by how steady my voice sounded even though my heart suddenly refused to settle into its familiar rhythm. The room was simple in the way only old roadside inns could be. One wide bed stood beneath a quilt stitched with faded blue flowers. A single armchair rested beside the window, where rain blurred the lights from the empty parking lot into soft golden circles. Somewhere downstairs an old clock chimed the hour, and the scent of fresh baked bread drifted faintly through the hallway. Victoria laughed quietly as she set her overnight bag on the wooden dresser. "I suppose life enjoys reminding us that plans are only polite suggestions." I smiled as I hung my damp jacket near the heater. "It has certainly been reminding me of that lately." The innkeeper returned a few minutes later carrying 2 bowls of homemade vegetable soup and slices of warm sourdough bread. "Kitchen is closed," she said with a kind smile, "but nobody should go to bed hungry during a storm." We thanked her, and after she left, we ate by the window while rain continued falling against the glass. The conversation wandered effortlessly from favorite authors to childhood vacations, from Olivia's endless curiosity as a little girl to my first apartment after college. Every story seemed to uncover another, and before long I realized we had been talking for hours without once looking at a clock. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said softly. "Of course." She folded her hands around her mug. "When did you know your marriage was over?" The question should have been painful, but somehow it was not. I stared at the rain for a long moment before answering. The day I realized we had stopped asking each other how we really were. We discussed bills, schedules, groceries, repairs. Everything except our hearts. Victoria nodded slowly. Loneliness inside a relationship can be harder than loneliness by yourself. I looked at her with quiet surprise. Exactly. She smiled gently. I know. Silence settled between us again. But it felt full instead of empty. After dinner we played an old board game we found on a shelf near the fireplace downstairs. The pieces were worn smooth from decades of use. We laughed every time one of us forgot the rules or made the same mistake twice. I could not remember the last time laughter had come so easily. It did not ask me to pretend. It simply arrived. Later that evening the power flickered once before returning. Victoria stood near the window watching the rain grow lighter. It should stop before morning, she whispered. I stepped beside her, close enough that our reflections blended softly in the glass. Outside, the storm was already beginning to move east, leaving quiet behind it. You were right, I said. Storms usually win. She looked at me instead of the window. Only for a little while. Her eyes held mine with a warmth that made the room feel smaller and the silence somehow louder. Without thinking, I reached up and gently brushed a tiny raindrop from the sleeve of her cardigan that had somehow escaped the towel hours earlier. My hand lingered for the briefest moment. Neither of us moved. I could hear my own heartbeat with startling clarity. Victoria drew a slow breath, and for one impossible second it felt as though the entire world had paused with us. Then she offered the faintest, saddest smile and stepped back. Emily, she said quietly, some feelings deserve honesty, but they also deserve patience. There was no rejection in her voice. Only wisdom. Only care. I nodded because I understood exactly what she meant, even if my heart wished it did not. That night she insisted on taking the armchair while I slept in the bed, refusing every argument with the same gentle determination I had come to admire. Long after the lights were turned off, I lay awake listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing across the room. I realized the hardest part was no longer admitting that something had changed between us. The hardest part was accepting that the most beautiful feelings sometimes arrived carrying questions that neither kindness nor courage could answer overnight. The rain had stopped by the time we left the inn the next morning. Mist floated above the fields, and the air carried that unmistakable freshness that only comes after a summer storm. The truck was ready before breakfast, the mechanic assuring us it had only been a failed alternator. Victoria thanked him with the same quiet sincerity she offered everyone, and before we climbed back into the cab, she handed me a warm cinnamon roll wrapped in wax paper from the inn's tiny bakery. For the road, she said with a smile that seemed a little more careful than before. The drive back to Cedar Falls felt different. Neither of us was uncomfortable, but we had both become more aware of the spaces between our words. Every glance lingered just long enough to remind us of the conversation we had not finished the night before. I kept replaying her sentence in my mind. Some feelings deserve honesty, but they also deserve patience. I wondered if patience was another word for fear, or perhaps another name for hope. When we finally pulled behind the bookstore, the familiar brick building greeted us like an old friend. We unloaded the boxes together, laughing whenever one proved heavier than expected. Work had always been our easiest language. It asked nothing except presence. By late afternoon, the newly purchased books filled an entire display near the front entrance. Victoria stepped back to admire it, folding her arms with quiet satisfaction. They have another chance now, she said. Stories should never spend their lives hidden in boxes. Before I could answer, the front door opened. Olivia walked inside pulling a small suitcase behind her, her face bright with surprise. I thought I would beat the delivery home, she laughed before wrapping me in a hug. Apparently I underestimated both of you. My heart lifted at the sight of my oldest friend, but something inside me tightened almost immediately. I glanced toward Victoria without meaning to. She was already smiling at her daughter, yet there was a hesitation in her expression so slight that only someone watching closely would notice it. Olivia spent the rest of the afternoon asking endless questions about the bookstore, the estate sale, the storm, and the night at the inn. None of her questions sounded suspicious. They sounded loving. She wanted details because she genuinely cared about both of us. That somehow made every answer feel heavier. During dinner upstairs, Olivia laughed about childhood memories while Victoria finished preparing roasted vegetables and grilled chicken. I watched them move comfortably around each other, completing familiar routines built over decades. It reminded me that I had stepped into something that belonged to their family long before I arrived. After we cleared the table, Olivia disappeared upstairs to unpack, leaving Victoria and me alone in the kitchen. She stood quietly at the sink, drying the last dinner plate before placing it carefully into the cabinet. "Everything feels different now," I whispered. She kept her eyes on the dish towel for a long moment. "Because it is." I wanted to tell her that I had not regretted a single moment of the past 2 weeks. I wanted to tell her that meeting her again had awakened parts of me I believed had disappeared forever. Instead, I simply asked, "What happens next?" She rested both hands on the edge of the counter and drew a slow breath. "We remember what matters most." Her voice remained gentle, but there was unmistakable sadness beneath it. "Olivia deserves complete honesty from both of us, even if neither of us fully understands our own hearts yet." I nodded because she was right, even though every instinct wanted to delay that conversation for one more day. As I climbed the stairs that night, I paused halfway and looked back. Victoria was standing alone in the darkened bookstore below, adjusting a single lamp beside the front window. The warm light reflected across the polished floor, leaving the rest of the room wrapped in quiet shadows. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Falls, I realized that healing sometimes asks us to face the very people we are most afraid of disappointing, before it allows us to discover who we truly are. The next morning arrived with the quiet confidence of a new season. Sunlight spilled through the front windows of the bookstore, catching tiny particles of dust that floated through the air like forgotten wishes finally finding their place. I came downstairs early, expecting to be alone, but Olivia was already arranging fresh flowers in a ceramic vase while Victoria prepared coffee behind the counter. They looked so familiar together that I almost turned back upstairs, afraid I was standing on the edge of a conversation that would change everything. Olivia looked up first. "Good," she said with an easy smile. "Now both of you are here." My heart immediately began racing. Victoria met my eyes for only a second before quietly setting 3 mugs on the counter. We carried them into the reading corner near the front window, where morning light wrapped around us with surprising warmth. Olivia took a slow sip before speaking. "I think both of you have been trying very hard to protect me." Neither Victoria nor I answered. "You do not have to." She folded her hands together and looked first at her mother, then at me. "I have known something was changing long before I came home." I felt every carefully built wall inside me begin to tremble. "Olivia," I whispered, "I never wanted to hurt you." She smiled with remarkable gentleness. "Emily, you have been my best friend for more than 20 years. You have stood beside me through every important moment of my life. Do you really think I would mistake kindness for betrayal?" Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. Victoria reached instinctively toward me, then paused, uncertain whether she should. Olivia noticed the movement and quietly smiled again. "Dad told me something during the last summer before he passed away," she said softly. "He said that if Mom ever found a reason to smile the way she used to, I should never let loneliness steal that gift from her." The room became impossibly still. Victoria lowered her head as silent tears slipped down her cheeks. "He actually said that?" she asked. Olivia nodded. "He knew you better than anyone." Victoria covered her face for a moment, breathing slowly as years of grief seemed to loosen all at once. I reached across the table and gently rested my hand beside hers, giving her every opportunity to move away if she wished. Instead, after the smallest hesitation, her fingers found mine. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was simply honest. Olivia stood quietly and walked toward the front door, pretending to straighten the display outside while giving us the privacy we had both been too afraid to ask for. Victoria looked at me with eyes that still carried sadness, but now they also held hope. "I spent so much time believing love belonged only to my past," she whispered. "Then you walked through that door." I smiled through tears of my own. I thought my life had already told its whole story. She squeezed my hand gently. "Perhaps we simply reached the beginning of a better chapter." Several weeks later, the bookstore held a small community gathering to celebrate its newly restored collection. Neighbors filled every aisle, children searched for adventure novels, and laughter echoed beneath the old wooden beams. I stood beside Victoria near the entrance as the evening sunlight painted the shelves in soft gold. Without hesitation or fear, she reached for my hand. This time neither of us looked around to see who might notice. We simply stood there together, exactly where life had unexpectedly brought us. As the last customer stepped outside and the brass bell chimed one final time, Victoria turned the sign from open to closed. We locked the door, switched off the lights one by one, and walked into the cool evening side by side beneath a sky slowly filling with stars. I finally understood that love does not always arrive when life is easy or predictable. Sometimes it quietly waits until two hearts have survived enough to recognize the peace they have been searching for all along. And, when that moment finally comes, the bravest choice is not holding on to the past, but gently opening the door to the future together.